Shavua Tov, Rabotai. This is Rabbi Kalman Akiva Kovacs. We are continuing in the Mishnah Yomi for Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and we are in the second parak of Kilayim and the 9th Mishnah. Harotze lasot sadehu karachat mikol min. Someone who wants to make his field into patches with individual species, different squares with different species in them. Now, this word karachat should sound familiar from Parshat Tazria. In Aliyah Shlishit, the third Aliyah of Tazria, it actually has a pasuk about karachat ve'ish ki yamaret rosho kireachu tahorhu, discussing the tzorat. If his hair falls out on the back of his head, that's called karachat, towards the back of the head, he doesn't have the hairs there. That would be a siman of being tameh from the tzarat. So he's tahor because he has this karachat. He has this bald spot. On the front of the head, it's called a gabachat. So just like the Eskimo have many words for snow, we have different words for baldness at the front of the head and at the back of the head. So Ashreinu that we were zoche to that. So this karachat, it could mean a bald patch, but here it means a patch of a various species. He wants to subdivide his field into smaller plots and put different species in each place. So what does he have to do? Ose esrim v'arba karachot. He makes 24 patches, lebeit seah, in a beit seah. Now remember, a beit seah is the amount of land that you use a seah of grain seeds to plant. And the seah was 6 kav. Mekarachat levet rova, and each karachat is a rova, is 1/4 of a kav. So he's planting 6 kav total. And that would be measured by wheat seeds or grain seeds, and each square is a rova hakav. So he's having 24 squares, sort of a 6x4 arrangement. We're assuming, and each square is about 10 amot by 10 amot. Zoreya betocha kol min sheyirtze. He can put any species he wants in each square. Haita karachat achat o shtayim. If he has 1 or 2 squares, zoram chardal. He can plant mustard in only 1 or 2 squares. Shalosh lo yizrayim chardal. But 3 squares don't do mustard. Mipnei shehi nirit kistei chardal. It looks like a field of mustard. Remember, mustard is a spice, so you don't plant a whole seah of it. Just 3 out of 3/24 of a seah, or 1/8 of a seah of chardal is considered a field of mustard, and then if you're planting other crops next to it, that would already look like Kilayim. Divrei Rabbi Meir. This whole opinion is Rabbi Meir only, who says that subdividing a field into squares, into 24 squares, each one is a rova size, you could plant 24 different species there as long as you don't have too much mustard. You could have 24 of other things as long as there's only one mustard square. Chachamim omrim, but the sages disagree with Rabbi Meir. They say tesha karachot mutarot. They say 9 squares would be mutar, eser asura, but never 10. So what's going on is they say you have to have an empty square between each square, whether that's from the top, the bottom, or the sides. So instead of dividing into 24 different squares, they only divide into 20. They divide actually into 25 squares. They have a 5x5 arrangement, and the top row, you're going to have a planted square, an empty square, a planted square, empty square, planted square. Now the second row underneath, it's going to be totally empty because you can't have adjacent planted squares of different species. So it's going to come out, you have a 5x5 matrix, and all of the corners are planted, and all of the middle squares are planted, and then the middle of the middle row is planted. So you have sort of this like tic-tac-toe board, but with spaces in between each tic-tac-toe game square. According to the Chachamim, you need this gap between your karachot. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, now he says something much more stringent, a bigger chumrah here. Afilu kosadeo bet kor, even if you have a bet kor, which is 30 beit seah, so it's huge. It's 30 times the beit seah field we're talking about. Lo yaseh betocha chutz mekarachat achat. You can only make 1 karachat, 1 patch, 1 species can be planted in your field. So he seems to say that your whole field is 1 unit and should never be subdivided. It's interesting, the Rav here, the Mefarish, the Bartnora says, Taima de Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov lo itparish. He says his reasoning was not explained why he's so machmir. So since the Bartnura doesn't explain it, I won't try. So we'll go on to Yud. Kol shehu betoich beit rova. Anything inside the rova. Now we're back to the Chachamim, who say you can plant these rova squares. You can have 25 squares, but you have to leave the gap. So really, you're planting 9 squares in the corners and in the middles. Ola b'mida. Beit rova, that counts towards the beit rova. So if you have something else taking up space, that counts towards the amount of a species you can plant in that karahat, in that patch. For example, achilat hagefen, the eating of the vine. Now, this doesn't mean the vine is eating things. This is not like a man-eating, a giant Venus flytrap that eats people. It means it takes up space to work the vine. You need room to plow under, to make ditches for watering, to harvest the grapes, to trim the vines. You need to get a guy, you need the space for a man to go in there and take care of the grapevine. That's achilat geffen. A kever, if there's a grave there, then that takes up space. You can't plant there. You can't plant on the grave, obviously. A sela, or a rock. Now, this is a rock that's not very big. We learned in this parak that a rock that's very wide and very tall counts as a mechitza, as a fence, and you could plant one species on one side of the rock and a totally different species right on the other side. So these are olin b'midat beit rova. These take up the space. So he has these 9 squares he can plant according to the Chachamim, but if one of them has a rock on it, that doesn't buy you extra space to plant. You don't get to plant the whole base rova because this rock is taking up some space. Tfua b'tfua, if you're planting one grain in another field of grain, beit rova. So you need a gap, a separation, that's a rova. It's about 10 amot. We mentioned yarak biyarak. If you're planting one vegetable in another area of vegetables, shisha tfachim. You can separate them by only 6 tfachim, which is much less than the 10 amos-ish of a base rova. Tfua biyarak. If you're planting grains next to vegetables, not literally inside vegetables, but next to them, base rova. You need a beit rova, again 10 amot in between, to make a good separation. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, he has a different opinion. Yorak betfua shisha tfachim. This is a different Rabbi Eliezer. This is Rabbi Eliezer Godel, not the one who was very machmir in the last Mishnah, but he says planting vegetables in a grain field, you only have to separate 6 tfachim. You don't need a larger separation. Obviously, you couldn't plant them. You couldn't make a bald patch in the middle of the grains and plant the vegetable there. The Mepharsh says that you can't surround it with the other species. This would be sort of on the edge of the grain field or vegetable field. You want to sow something else, so this is the gap that's necessary to do this. Shkayach Rabotai, Shavua Tov.